The Velhari didn't have a word for rust. Their ships were grown, not built. Membrane over mineral, slow crystalline structures that took 30 years to mature into something capable of crossing a gravity well. They didn't weld. They didn't cut. They didn't pour anything into molds and wait for it to harden into shape. So when Scout Reader Esseven first picked up the thermal signature from the third planet of a dead yellow star, she filed it under anomalous geological event and moved on. It was her assistant, a young calculation tender named Foss, who pulled the file back 2 days later. "It breathes," Foss said. Esseven looked at him the way senior Velhari always looked at juniors, with her secondary membranes half lowered, which was the equivalent of a slow, patient blink. "Geological events don't breathe, Foss. This one does." He spread the thermal map across the observation panel. He said, "It happens every 6.4 seconds. Regular. Mechanical." Esseven studied it. The signature was massive. The signature was larger than their entire home settlement on Velhar Prime. It pulsed with a rhythm that had no natural explanation. Not tidal, not volcanic, not biological in any way she recognized. "How deep?" she asked. "That's the thing," Foss said quietly. "It's not underground. It's surface level. Something built it. Something put it there on purpose." They dropped into low orbit the next morning. What they saw made Esseven's secondary membranes close completely, a full-body flinch that Velhari only showed in private. The most brutal architecture she had ever encountered covered the planet's northern landmass, edge to edge. Not beautiful, not elegant. It wasn't cultivated with patience over several decades. It was hammered into existence. Enormous structures of compacted iron and reinforced composite, angular and aggressive, all of it oriented toward the sky like an argument. And at the center of it all, still breathing, still cycling, still running after what the geological surveys suggested was at least 300 years of abandonment. A shipyard. Not one ship. Not 10. Hundreds. Row after row of half-finished hulls, enormous beyond anything the Velhari had ever attempted, sitting in dry dock cradles that were themselves larger than most Velhari cities. And between them, moving with the slow, tireless patience of something that had forgotten it was supposed to stop, the machines. They were called, in the operational language still running on the shipyard's internal network, Fabrication Autonomous Units, FAUs. But Esseven, after 3 days of watching them from orbit, started calling them something else in her mind. Devoted. That was the only word that fit. They moved through the shipyard the way Esseven had once watched a flood move through a valley, not with purpose exactly, but with a kind of absolute commitment to their direction. Each FAU was roughly the size of a Velhari dwelling structure, 6-legged, low to the ground, and covered in tool arms that folded and unfolded depending on the task. They didn't communicate with each other in any way Esseven could detect. They didn't coordinate. They didn't plan. And yet somehow, collectively, they were finishing the ships. Slowly. After 300 years, only a fraction of the work remained. But it was being done. "The builders are gone," Foss said, reviewing the biological scans. "The planet shows prior civilization markers, atmospheric residue from combustion industry, and trace architectural foundations beneath soil accumulation. However, there are no active biological signatures visible above the microbial level." "They left the machines running," Esseven said. "It appears so." "Why?" Foss had no answer. Esseven pressed her observation lens against the viewport. One of the FAUs below had paused in front of a section of incomplete hull plating. It extended 3 of its tool arms, made a series of precise measurements, then began pulling material from a stockpile that should, by any reasonable calculation, have run out 2 centuries ago. "Where is it getting the raw material?" she asked. Foss checked. Checked again. Then, Foss made a small sound that, in Velhari's language, indicated profound discomfort. "It's recycling the planet." Esseven turned slowly. "Say that again." "The FAUs have been mining. Systematically. The bedrock composition of the northern continent has decreased by approximately 14% over 300 years. They've been pulling iron, carbon composite, and rare structural minerals, pulling it all up, processing it and feeding it into the ships. Voss looked at her. They are finishing the fleet. They are using the planet itself as a raw material. At current rates, the northern continent will be structurally compromised within another 200 years. Esavin stared at the shipyard for a long time. The builders didn't leave the machines running by accident, she said finally.
No.
They intended the fleet to be finished. Yes. Even after they were gone. A silence settled over the observation deck. Below, the FAUs moved between hulls with their slow, devoted patience, assembling a fleet for a civilization that no longer existed, following orders issued by hands that had turned to dust 3 centuries ago. Esavin felt something she didn't have a precise Velhari word for. Her species called the closest equivalent Theverin, the feeling of witnessing something that should not exist continuing to exist out of sheer, unreasonable momentum. It wasn't awe. It wasn't fear. It was closer to grief. They sent a relay drone down on the 4th day. Esavin wasn't interested in the ships. She was interested in the network, the operational language still running in the shipyard's core systems, still issuing task assignments to the FAUs, still logging completion percentages with the steady bureaucratic calm of something that had no idea 300 years had passed. Voss spent 18 hours working through the translation matrix before he got his first clean read. It's structured like a message, he said. He sounded uncertain in a way that made Esavin put down what she was doing. A message to whom? To whoever found this, I think. Voss pulled up the translated text. It begins with a mathematical primer, base 10 counting, then geometric proofs, then physical constants. Standard first contact scaffolding. They expected someone to find the information eventually. Read it. Voss read. If you are reading this, then we are gone. We want you to understand that we knew we would be gone. We resisted, and we do not ask you to mourn us. We were not a peaceful people. We tried very hard for a long time, and it cost us everything, including our sense of community and trust in one another. We built these ships because we thought the universe was dangerous in unseen ways, and we feared we would be unprepared for the threats ahead without them. We were right. The danger materialized before we completed the ships. We ask nothing from you except one thing. Look at what we built. Not the ships. We used these machines to build the ships. We made them devoted. We made them patient. We made them unable to stop. We thought that was the right choice. We believed that devotion without limit was the highest form of commitment. We were wrong. The machines will finish the fleet. They'll finish it no matter what you say or do. They can't hear you and would ignore you if they could. The fleet will be completed. The ships will be ready. But ready for what? Ready for whom? We cannot answer that. We could only build the question. The danger that destroyed us did not come from outside. It came from inside, from our own certainty that we were building the right thing for the right reasons, despite the evidence suggesting that our actions were leading to destruction and chaos. We are leaving you a fleet of war machines and a planet half consumed. We're sorry. We just couldn't stop either. The observation deck was very quiet after Voss finished reading. Outside, the FAUs continued their slow, devoted work. Esavin sat with the translated message for a long time before she spoke. How many ships? She asked. Upon completion, Voss estimated the number of ships to be approximately 412. The vessels possess a scale and apparent armament capability that surpasses anything found in the current Velhari defense catalog by a significant margin. And the FAUs will finish them. Nothing we have can stop the FAUs. They're built from the same materials as the ships. They would dismantle any interference and recycle it. Esavin looked at her assistant. He was young. He had a particular expression she recognized, the expression of someone who had just realized that a situation had weight. Send a full report to the assembly, she said. Priority classification. What classification code? Esavin thought about the message. This text is about a civilization that had built devotion into metal and was then destroyed by its own certainty. The message spoke of a fleet that stood ready for no one. About 412 ships were waiting to be crewed by hands that did not yet exist. There isn't a code for this, she said. Create one. The Velhari Grand Assembly had not convened a full emergency session in 60 years. They convened one now. Esseven was attended by a relay link from orbit. Her image was projected onto the central floor of the assembly chamber on Velher Prime, 400 light hours away. She watched 47 senior delegates argue for 6 hours and found herself thinking about the FAU's field assessment units, which were known for their silence, focus, and complete indifference to anything that wasn't the work. The assembly was loud. The assembly cared very much about many things simultaneously, including the shipyard's implications for their communities and the various proposals on the table. The assembly could not agree on what the shipyard meant. Delegate Korath of the Northern Families spoke first and longest. She believed the fleet represented an opportunity, military capability the Velhari had never possessed and could never build in their lifetimes. "We grow our ships in 30 years, she said. "These beings built 400 in. How long, Scout Reader?" "We estimate the original construction began approximately 340 years ago," Esseven said. "The builder's extinction event occurred before the original construction began." 340 years for 400 warships, Korath said. "And they're nearly finished. We could crew them. We have the population. We have the pilots. We could." "We could what, exactly?" said old Delegate Marin, who had been in the assembly longer than Esseven had been alive. "Sail a dead civilization's vengeance fleet across the galaxy? To fight whom? For what cause? The builders are gone. Their enemies, whatever destroyed them, are almost certainly also gone. This site is a monument to a war that ended 3 centuries ago." "The ships don't care whose war it was," Korath replied. "Precisely my concern." The argument cycled. It had a familiar shape, the shape of every assembly argument Esseven had ever observed. The same positions, the same fears, and the same certainties were dressed in new vocabulary, reflecting the ongoing struggle and resistance to change that had characterized previous debates. She found herself thinking about the last lines of the builder's message. "We just couldn't stop either." She waited for a pause in the debate and then spoke carefully into it. "With respect to the assembly, I believe we are asking the wrong question." 47 delegates turned toward her projection. "We are asking what to do with the fleet," she said. "But the builder's message suggests the fleet itself is not the important thing. The important thing is what the fleet represents about the builders and what it might represent about us if we claim it." Silence. "They built machines that could not stop. And then they built a culture that could not stop, characterized by relentless productivity and an obsession with efficiency, which ultimately contributed to their downfall. And then they were destroyed, not by an outside enemy, the message implies, but by their own momentum, which led to unsustainable practices and ultimately their downfall, such as overconsumption of resources and environmental degradation. Their certainty." She paused. "If we take those ships, we are not inheriting a fleet. We are inheriting a trajectory. This trajectory has already consumed an entire civilization." Delegate Korath's expression was unmoved. "Or, we are inheriting a tool. A tool is only as dangerous as the hand that holds it." The builders said the same thing. Esseven replied. "I suspect." Another silence. Longer this time. Old Delegate Marin leaned forward. "What do you recommend, Scout Reader?" Esseven looked at the relay feed from the shipyard. The FAUs moving between the hulls, patient and devoted, and completely indifferent to the conversation happening above them. "I recommend we stay," she said. "And watch. And think very carefully before we touch anything." She paused. "I recommend we consider the possibility that the most dangerous thing in that shipyard is something other than the weapons on those ships. It is the lesson of the machines that built them." Against Esseven's explicit recommendation, the assembly sent a ground team, not a military team. Esseven had at least won that argument. It was a documentation team, 6 researchers, 2 engineers, and Foss, who had volunteered before Esseven could stop him. "You don't need to go," she told him, the night before descent. "I want to understand them," he said. "The builders. Not the ships. Not the machines. I want to understand who they were before they became this." He gestured at the thermal feed. "Before they became a warning." She couldn't argue with that. She'd wanted the same thing from the moment she read the message. "Stay away from the FAUs," she said. "I know. I mean physically. Not protocol away. Not observation distance away. If one turns toward you, you leave the area immediately. I understand. Foss. She waited until he looked at her directly. They were built to finish the work. The work is on the ships. If the machines assess you as a material resource. I'll be careful, he said. He descended the next morning. The ground team landed 2 kilometers from the nearest active FAU cluster, in a section of the shipyard that the machines had already completed. Older dry dock structures now empty, the ships they'd built already moved to the finished staging area at the northern end of the facility. The architecture hit Foss harder than he'd expected. He'd grown up in Valhari construction, organic, curved, grown slowly from mineral seed over years, buildings that felt like they had arrived rather than been imposed. The shipyard was the opposite of everything he knew. It was declared. Every surface was flat by intention. Every angle was chosen. Every joining was a decision. It was exhausting to look at. They were in a hurry, said engineer Tavis, walking beside him. The whole facility has the feel of something built against a deadline. 340 years is a long deadline, Foss said. The threat must be invisible when they start. Foss considered that. He walked to the wall of a dry dock structure and pressed his palm against the iron. It was cold. The metal was incredibly cold, indicating that it had been in the shade for decades, if not longer. Something in the texture was unexpected. He looked closer. The wall was covered in marks. Not structural. Not mechanical. Made by hands. Thousands and thousands of small marks, pressed or scratched into the metal, covering every accessible surface of the dry dock interior. What is that? Tavis asked. Foss activated his translation matrix. Looked at the marks. Let the system process. The marks were names. Hundreds of thousands of names, pressed into the metal of the shipyard by the workers who had built it, layer over layer over layer, in script styles that shifted over generations. Older, faded marks near the bottom. Newer marks near the top. The most recent still sharp enough to read clearly. The last name on the wall had been pressed in approximately 300 years ago. Below it, someone, the last person or one of the last, had written something longer than a name. Foss read the translation slowly. We who made these ships were afraid. We want whoever finds this to know that. Not proud. Afraid. We hoped fear was enough to make us careful. It wasn't. Remember us as people who tried. We should not be remembered as individuals who achieved success. Foss stood in front of that wall for a very long time. Behind him, 2 kilometers away, an FAU, factory automation unit, turned in its slow, devoted circle and continued building the ships that the afraid, careful, failing people had designed. It happened on the 19th day of the ground mission. Foss was in the archive structure. They'd found a secondary facility, partially collapsed, containing physical data storage media of a type the engineers had spent a week learning to read, when the alert came through. FAU activity change, said the orbital relay in Estevan's voice. All units, simultaneous. Foss stepped outside. The shipyard had a sound. It always had a sound, a low mechanical cycling that you stopped hearing after the first day because it never changed. There was the sound of the FAUs working, the sound of tools and material being used, and the sound of patient assembly. The sound had stopped. Foss looked toward the northern staging area. Every FAU, field automation unit, in the shipyard had gone still. 412 units, scattered across kilometers of facility, had simultaneously ceased movement. They stood in whatever position they'd been in when the signal, whatever signal, had reached them. A welder's arm half extended. A transport unit mid-stride. The structural placement unit was holding a hull panel that it would never be able to place. They had finished. The last ship, hull designation in the builder's notation system translated roughly as enduring argument, had received its final panel 11 minutes ago, while Foss was reading old names on a wall. The fleet was complete. 412 warships, each one larger than anything the Valhari had ever grown or built, sitting in their staging cradles in perfect silence, pointing at the sky. The machines that had built them stood absolutely still, as there was nothing left to build and no instructions for what to do when the work was done. Foss stared at them. He'd been afraid of the FAU's fully automated units for 19 days. Now, Looking at them frozen mid-motion, he felt the grief that Esavin had felt from orbit on day one. He opened his calm Esavin. "I see it," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "What do we do now?" A long pause. "I don't know," she said. "I genuinely don't know." The assembly reconvened. This time the debate had a different quality. Less argument, more silence between the words. The fleet's completion had shifted something in the delegates that no amount of orbital imagery had managed, leading to a profound sense of responsibility and urgency among them as they contemplated the implications of their decisions. The scale of it, the finality of it. The fleet consisted of 412 ships. Ready. Crewed by no one. The two positions remained. Korth's faction wanted to claim the fleet, crew it, and use it as a deterrent or instrument of Velhari expansion into contested space. Marin's faction wanted to document and leave, mark the system as a protected memorial site, take no ships, take no weapons, and take only data. Esavin had a third option. She'd spent 3 days constructing it. Not the arguments, she'd had those almost immediately. The language. The Velhari language did not have good words for what she wanted to propose, which she suspected was important information in itself, as it indicated a potential barrier to effective communication and understanding among the factions involved. "Neither faction is wrong," she said when the assembly gave her the floor. "Delegate Korth is correct that the fleet represents a genuine capability the Velhari have never possessed. Delegate Marin is correct that claiming it carries a trajectory we should be afraid of." She paused. "But both factions are treating the ships as the primary object of this decision. I want to propose that they are not." She pulled up the image of the FAUs, still frozen, exactly as they'd been the moment the last hull was completed. 19 FAUs are still mid-motion, preserved in the positions of their final tasks. The builder's message asked us to look at the machines, not the ships. And I have been looking at them for 3 weeks, and I believe I finally understand what the message meant. She let the image sit. The FAUs are frozen due to a lack of further instructions. They completed their purpose and stopped. They did not choose a new purpose. They did not repurpose themselves. They did not decide anything. They simply stopped because stopping was the only option when the work was done. She looked at the assembly. The builder's civilization did not stop. When their original purpose was complete, or when it became impossible, they could not redirect. They had built their entire culture around the momentum of the project, which included their social structures, values, and daily practices that revolved around its completion. The culture was the project. And when the project reached its crisis point, the culture could not adapt. It collapsed. A delegate she didn't recognize raised a speaking hand. "Are you suggesting the Velhari face a similar risk?" "I'm suggesting," Esavin said carefully, "that every civilization faces this risk. And the builders knew it. The message wasn't a warning about the ships. It was a warning about the state of mind that builds ships like these, the state of mind that cannot ask whether the building should stop." She looked at Korth. "If we take the fleet because it is powerful, we are not free from the trajectory. We are choosing it." She looked at Marin. "We've learned something if we leave the fleet out of fear, but we haven't acted on it." "Then what is the third option?" Marin asked. "The builders could not stop their machines," Esavin said. "But we can reprogram them." Silence. "The FAUs are frozen. They have no current instructions. The network that ran them is still active, still accepting input. We could not have touched them while they were working. They would have processed any interference as raw material. But the work is done. They are waiting." She let that land. "I am proposing that we do not take the fleet. And I am proposing that we do not leave it. I suggest we give the machines a new set of instructions. My proposal does not involve the construction of additional ships, nor arming what's already built, but to dismantle, slowly, over years, in the same patient, dev, nor RNG built, so that the builder's planet is returned to itself. So that the debt the shipyard owes that ground is paid." "And the ships?" Korth asked. "Document them completely. Take every design, every material innovation, and every engineering solution. Take the data. Leave the iron." She paused. "And leave the builders' names on the wall." While the assembly deliberated, Foss finished reading the archive. It took him 4 more days. Most of it was technical: construction logs, material inventories, maintenance schedules, and the bureaucratic skeleton of a civilization at war readiness. He read it carefully and found it exhausting. But at the very end, in a section of the archive that appeared to have been added much later than the rest, the file dating suggested within the last 50 years of the builder's existence, he found something different. Not technical documents. Personal ones. Journals. Thousands of them were submitted voluntarily to the archive by workers and engineers and administrators, and, in some cases, people who appeared to have had no formal role in the project at all, people who had just lived near the shipyard and felt compelled to write something down. Foss read them for hours. They were not what he expected. He had anticipated records of fear, of urgency, and of the grim, focused determination of people who believed they were building toward survival. And those were there. But they were not the majority. The majority were ordinary. A worker recounted her favorite meal from the facility's commissary. A man writing about his daughter's first word, a Velhari equivalent of the builder's language, something that sounded like it meant bright. An older administrator meticulously documented the unique characteristics of the early morning light on the northern shipyard floor, observing how it penetrated the ventilation gaps and swept across the hull sections in long, warm bars. People noticing things. People are finding the small, unremarkable worth of their days remarkable enough to record. A quiet, persistent doubt weaves through all of it, like a thread you didn't notice until you stepped back. Is this the right thing to build? Not rebellion. Not refusal. The question persistently resurfaced, manifested in varying handwriting styles, varying years, and various methods of inquiry. Is this the right thing to build? And underneath the question, never quite answered, always deferred for later, a deeper one. If the danger never comes, what will we have made ourselves into, waiting for it? Foss sat in the half-collapsed archive, surrounded by the words of dead people, and felt the answer to that question hanging in the air like something physical. He opened his comm. "Estevan. I'm here." "They knew," he said, "the whole time. They knew the project might be wrong. They wrote it down. They recorded the doubt. They kept building anyway." There was a prolonged period of silence on the line. "Yes," Estevan said softly. "I think that's what the message was trying to tell us." "Then why?" "Because knowing something is wrong and being able to stop are two different skills," she said. And they had only built one of them. Foss looked at the archive walls. At the words of people who had noticed the light in the mornings and wondered about their daughter's first words and felt the particular comfort of a satisfying meal and still could not redirect the thing they had set in motion. "I want to take the journals," he said. "The personal ones. I want to bring them back. The assembly's decision. Not the ships. Not the schematics. Just the journals." He paused. "They asked to be remembered as people who tried, not people who succeeded. I think the journals are the proof of that." Another long silence. "Yes," Estevan said. "I think we can do that." The assembly voted. It wasn't close. The vote was 31-16 in favor of Estevan's proposal. Korth's faction did not concede gracefully. 3 delegates filed formal dissent records, arguing that the Velhari were surrendering a strategic asset out of philosophical sentiment, that the dead civilization's guilt was not the Velhari's to carry, and that the fleet represented exactly the kind of capability that kept peace through deterrence. Estevan read all 3 dissent records. She did not think the dissenters were stupid or wrong in every respect. She thought they were asking the same questions the builders had asked, and she believed the answers the builders had found should be instructive. She kept that thought to herself. The engineering team spent 9 days studying the FAU network interface. It was not easy work. The builders' programming logic was structured around assumptions of continuous task assignment, not the kind of discrete instruction and completion the Velhari systems were built for. It was, as lead engineer Tavis put it with deep professional annoyance, a language that assumes you will never want to stop. But they found a way. On the 28th day of the mission, with full assembly authorization and Estevan present on the ground for the first time, they uploaded the new instruction set to the FAU, Field Automation Unit, network. It took 12 seconds for the network to process and distribute. Then the machines began to move again. The machines were not aimed at the completed ships, not toward the stockpiles. They turned, slowly, with the same deliberate patience they had brought to everything, toward the mine shafts and the extraction points and the geological wounds the shipyard had spent 3 centuries cutting into the planet. They began to fill them in. It would take a long time. 200 years, the engineers estimated, for the planet to recover anything like its original structural integrity. It would take an additional century for the soil chemistry to stabilize sufficiently to support biological resurgence. The builders had taken 300 years to hollow out the planet. It would take 300 years to give it back. Estevan stood at the edge of the dry dock floor and watched an FAU, freight automated unit, the size of a building, carry a load of processed earth back toward a mine shaft with the same devoted silence it had once carried hull panels toward an incomplete ship. Foss stood beside her. "Do you think they would have wanted this?" he asked. "The builders?" Estevan took the question seriously, because it deserved serious consideration. "I think some of them would have wanted it immediately," she said. "They were the ones who wrote about the light in the mornings. They were the ones who documented the uncertainty." She paused. "The others, the ones who built the momentum, I think they would have argued against it. Like Korth's faction. Like Korth's faction." She watched the FAU descend into the shaft, smooth and unhurried. "I think the builders had both kinds of people and the second kind won, and that's why the message exists. The first kind wrote it." Foss was quiet for a moment. "Do we have both kinds?" "Of course we do." She looked at him. "The question isn't whether both kinds exist. The question is, which kind gets to write the next chapter?" Below them, the machines worked. The Velhari mission departed the builders' system 41 days after arrival. They took complete technical documentation of 412 warship designs, totaling the largest single engineering dataset in Velhari history. Every alloy and composite that the builders had developed was subjected to a materials analysis. The mapping of the FAU programming architecture was conducted solely for academic study, adhering to the Assembly's mandate. And the journals. 47,000 personal records, copied in full, belonging to people whose names Estevan could not pronounce and whose faces she would never know. The fleet stayed. The FAU stayed. The planet stayed, beginning its slow return to itself, tended by machines that had finally been given an instruction that went in the other direction. The Velhari sent a marker buoy at the edge of the system with a notation in 12 languages, memorial site. "Do not disturb the FAU remediation process. Contact the Velhari Assembly before approaching." It wasn't a prohibition. It was an invitation to the conversation that Estevan believed the builders had been trying to start for 300 years. She filed her full mission report on the journey home. It was the longest document she had ever written, longer than her doctoral work, longer than her 12-year service record. She tried to include everything in it, even the parts that did not reflect well on the Assembly's deliberation process, such as her own uncertainty, Foss's 4 days in the archive, and what he had found there. The report was distributed assembly-wide and then, in an unusual move that Delegate Marin personally championed, made public. Within a year, it had traveled, through Velhari communication relays, through trade route transmissions, through the slow, branching network of interstellar contact, to 14 other civilizations. Estevan never knew that most of those civilizations received it. She was retired by then, living in a structure grown from mineral seed over 30 patient years, watching the light change on the walls and writing small things down. But Foss knew. Foss, who had become something of an expert on the builders and their journals, who had spent 20 years parsing the psychological architecture of a civilization that could not stop, who had begun to develop a field of study that the Velhari did not have a name for yet, something between archaeology and ethics and engineering philosophy. Foss received a message from a relay station at the edge of known Velhari space. It was from a civilization called, in rough translation, the Assembled Threads. They were, the message said, in the middle of a huge project. They had been for some time. The project was important. The project was necessary. The project was, their engineers believed, the most critical thing their civilization had ever undertaken. But they had received the mission report, the one about the builders, about the fleet, about the machines that could not stop, and they had a question they wanted to ask someone. How do you know when to stop? Foss read the message 3 times. Then he wrote back. He did not have a complete answer. He told them directly, having learned from the builders' journals that false certainty was more dangerous than honest uncertainty. But he had the beginning of an answer. He had 47,000 journals from people who had wondered the same thing while their hands kept working. He sent those too. She wrote it in the 32nd year after the mission. She was old by Velhari standards, not ancient, but past the age when most of her colleagues had shifted their attention inward, toward family and settlement and the quieter work of late life. She still thought about the builders. She thought she always would. The entry was short. She wasn't trying to write anything important. She was sitting in her grown structure, watching the morning light come through the mineral lattice windows. The light had a particular quality this time of year, warm and long, lying across the floor like it intended to stay, and she picked up her notation pad and wrote. The builders asked the wrong question. They asked, "What are we building toward?" They should have asked, "What are we building away from?" Those are different questions. The first question has an end point. You reach the goal, or you fail to, but either way the trajectory terminates. The second question has no end point. You are always moving away from something. You are always watching over your shoulder. You never finish. They couldn't stop because they couldn't answer the first question. The danger never came, or it came differently than expected, or it came from inside, and the project had no mechanism for an answer that wasn't arrival. We gave the machines a new instruction. Fill it back in. Return it. Undo the extraction. The machines didn't argue. They didn't grieve. They turned around and started going the other way. I have spent 30 years wishing it were that easy for the rest of us. I have spent 30 years thinking it might be so. The light is excellent this morning. Foss says the Assembled Threads project has been scaled back by 40%, not stopped, but reevaluated. He says they used the word enough in their official announcement. This appears to be the first time they have used the word enough in a policy document. Enough. What a word to learn. I think the builders knew it. Some of them. Those who wrote about the light were aware of it. They knew enough. They just couldn't say it loud enough or often enough or to the right people at the right time. We carried their words across the stars and gave them to strangers, and the strangers heard them. I think that counts. I think that is what the message was for. I think we did all right. 312 years after the Velhari mission, a survey vessel from a civilization the builders would not have recognized and the Velhari would have found only distantly familiar, came through the dead yellow stars system. The planet had changed. The FAUs were still working, having passed the halfway point of the remediation approximately 80 years earlier, according to the planetary geological record. The mine shafts were mostly filled. The soil chemistry was normalizing. In the lower latitudes, where the extraction had been shallowest, something was beginning to grow. Not much, not yet, but the trace markers were there. Life was gradually making its way back into the repaired ground. The fleet was still in its staging cradles. 412 ships, 312 years older than the last time anyone had formally documented them, showing the expected surface oxidation and micro-impact weathering of centuries, but structurally, by all scanner readings, intact. The survey commander, a being named, in her own language, something that translated approximately as soft edge of morning water, read the marker buoy's notation, cross-referenced the Velhari mission report that had been circulating the interstellar communication networks for 3 centuries, and called her team together. "We are not to disturb the remediation process," she said. "Understood," said her team. "We are to contact the Velhari assembly before approach." She paused. "We will do that." "And the ships?" asked her navigator. We could, she agreed. "We won't." She looked at the staging cradles on the long-range visual feed. The ships. The waiting, patient, finished ships that had been ready for 300 years and had never once been needed for the purpose they were built for. The builders asked a question they never answered, she said. "What are these ships for if the danger doesn't come?" She watched the FAUs move through the planetary surface below, filling in the old wounds, grain by grain, with the same devotion they had once poured into everything going the other direction. "I think the answer is nothing," she said. "I think that's the point. They're not for anything. They're the evidence of a question. A very expensive question. A question that cost a whole planet and a whole civilization." She closed the visual feed. "Log it. Send the contact message to the Velhari. And let's move on." The survey vessel turned away from the dead yellow star. Behind it, on a planet slowly coming back to life, the machines worked in their quiet and devoted way, undoing what had been done, paying what could be paid. The fleet waited in its cradles. The question hung in the empty air above it, the same as it always had, the same as it always would. What are we building toward? And the planet, very slowly, began to answer with the only word it had. Something that grows. Yendi.